Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hey, it's the Better Sex Podcast. This is Jessa. Thank you so much for tuning in and sharing this time with me. I so appreciate all of you who follow along, and I certainly am hoping to offer value and helpful information in doing these shows. I try to pick a variety of topics, and a lot of times I'll hear from people who reach out to me to be guests on the show, and so I'm exposed to new concepts or new ideas or something I hadn't really thought to emphasize before. And this is one of those. This episode is about interpersonal neurobiology, or relational neuroscience. No matter how you phrase it, it's kind of a mouthful and a little bit confusing. But my guest, Heidi Crockett, is a professional counselor and speaker on stress and sex, and she has put an awful lot of effort into learning about neuroscience. She's actually written a book called The Neuroscience of Dating. So she's an expert in how our brains affect each other, how our brains are affected by relationships, by attachment, by experiences, and then specifically, what can we do as adults to develop basically healthier brains, better functioning brains, because we're sort of dealt a hand, when we're born and we have whatever experiences we have. It can show up as, I don't want to quite say deficits, but as challenges or things we might struggle with being impulsive or being triggered or getting flooded. And she's going to talk specifically about how our brains affect each other and what we can do to gain more and more brain health and control over how we respond in order that we can have even that much more attachment and connection and pleasure with our partner. So Heidi Crockett is my guest today. Hope you enjoy the show. Heidi, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so it's a mouthful, I think, relational neuroscience. What in the world is that? Can you explain that to the listeners?
I'm always trying to figure out how to condense it. It's relational. Another word for that is interpersonal.
Right.
And neuroscience, another word for that is neurobiology. So it's actually called interpersonal neurobiology, which is even more of a mouthful. But I call it relational neuroscience because people are like, they sort of have more of a framework for that. But let me explain just a little bit what it is for people.
Yeah.
It was created by a neuropsychiatrist named Dr. Dan Siegel in the 90s, and it's like an interdisciplinary science. So it looks at what he calls consilience, which is what very different fields of science share in common. So for the listeners, just think of it as like interdisciplinary science.
Okay.
And so I'm going to explain the basic framework of it, which is integration. So the heart of interpersonal neurobiology is what he calls integration. And integration is high differentiation and high linkage equals integration. And so the interesting thing is when I say that to people, it doesn't mean anything because it's just words.
Right.
So I'm going to do just like a 30-second kind of guided imagery thing to help people understand that.
Okay.
So if the listener can, right now at this point in time, begin to notice their breath. So just take a second and be aware of your breath. And if you want, you can put your hand on your chest. And what you're doing is you're differentiating from the sound of my words, and you're linking up to your internal experience. And it's called SIFT, S-I-F-T, sifting, like in terms of your internal experience. In relational neuroscience, that stands for sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts. But right now I'm asking everyone here to pay attention to your sensations.
Right.
And then now what people can do is they can begin to link up to my words and differentiate from those internal body sensations I just asked you to be aware of. And when you hear my words, what you may begin to do is you'll hear the word mind sight, which is a new word you've never heard before. And what that is that's eyesight, but for the mind. So what we're doing is we're using the mind to focus on different things to increase our integration. So everyone can just kind of take a deep breath. And the intention right now to our listeners is I'm hoping they may have a higher level of integration right now than they did when we began this podcast interview, just in the sense that maybe they have high differentiation plus high linkage, right? Both. And what I just did there is called interpersonal integration. It's like where you're happy alone and you're happy with someone else. So there's 9 domains of integration and 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex. It's like a bunch of language.
Right.
Yeah, they're all higher functions. And basically, the more you become integrated, the smarter you are. So I always tell people, like, I'm going to use a bunch of big words, but the words don't so much matter. I think you're kind of understanding what I'm saying. And then as we talk, then we'll apply that to sex later on.
Right. So are you saying there's sort of a flow of paying attention to my experience, but then you, like, that is sort of a dance between I'm aware of you and then I'm aware, I bring it back to myself, and that's sort of a flow between those?
And what relational neuroscience is that it's about the relational nature of the brain. So we used to think the brain was just encased in the skull, like embodied. But we know that actually it's also relational. So when I give talks, I put my hand out, and when the people are looking at me, I say, this is your brain. So it kind of, it's a little bit, I say I make visible the invisible because it's a little hard for people to grasp. But the point is, because of the nature of our connection, like I hope with my connection with you, either we can get a higher state of integration, or like if a fire alarm were to go off, or if I were to start screaming, it would cause us to have a lower state of integration, and that would affect our brain health. So that's the idea.
Okay. So, and the idea, I suppose, that our brains, we are affected by each other. Our brain is actually affected by our interactions or by our exposure to someone else's mind. Let
me say specifically, I'm a big fan of Dr. Gabor Mate's. He has a book called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, which is about addiction and attachment. And in that book, he talked about when the baby's born, let's say the brain is about 25% developed. And then by age 3, it's 90% developed. So when we talk about attachment, but people don't realize, and then the brain starts shaving down after that. But those first 3 years are so important in terms of what your mirror neurons and your attachment. The brain is developed by the connection with its outside world.
So it's not just a concept, it like physically affects the functioning of our brain, our attachment and our experiences, right? It's like laid down in brain matter.
Yes.
Or neurons or something.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see if I get clear about this. So brain integration, you said there's integration and there's linkage. Right?
Yeah, differentiation and linkage.
Oh, differentiation and linkage. Okay. So what's an example of high integration
versus
what's low? Yeah. Just so I get this clear.
Yeah. So there's this book I really like called The Craving Mind, From Cigarettes to Smartphones to Love, How We Get Addicted and Why. And at the very beginning of the book, he compares what he calls like a sea slug. He compares addiction to a sea slug that has 20,000 neurons. So he says it only takes 3 neurons to have a behavior. He calls it trigger behavior reward. And that's like addiction, trigger behavior reward. And so when we're in a lower state of integration, where we're not using our higher functions and thinking about thinking, and this prefrontal cortex is higher functions of our brain. It's called executive function. A lot of people don't know this, but it actually is really about inhibiting action. It's about inhibiting action and then thinking about thinking and using our conscious awareness to make a choice as opposed to just being reactive. So low integration is someone who's more trigger behavior reward. They're like a 20,000 neuron sea slug versus
so more
a human.
impulsive, more,
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Impulsive. They're not using all the neurons. So a human brain has like 86 billion neurons, something like that. And we can, if our brain is well integrated, we can inhibit those impulses, right? And do things like insight and empathy and attuned communication and morality, all these, it's called response flexibility, all these higher functions. So that would be high integration. So I'm just trying to distinguish between the two.
Okay. So I'm certainly getting the sense that our attachment and our experiences and things like trauma are going to affect our brain, right? Especially in those first 3 years, it sounds like, but probably over our lifetime.
Yeah, I have so many things I could say about it. In my caregiver stress book, I call it the Superhighway. I talk about neurogenesis. I call it like paving your dirt road. And so what happens is the axons and the dendrites of your neurons from childhood, they're thicker and there are more of them. And that's what the superhighway is. And people know this. When you get stressed out, you go for that tub of ice cream. You just do these things. And I was listening to that podcast with you and Stan Tatkin, and I think he was saying that in the bedroom, it's so easy for people to just go on autopilot because I think what happens, stress response just kicks in and we go unconscious. So yeah, stress, trauma, all those things, it impairs integration.
Okay, so that's laying down a superhighway that's not highly integrated.
Correct.
Okay,
yeah.
But we're not a lost cause? I mean...
No,
is there anything, what in the world, you get a kid who's born in this world with, in a really unfortunate situation with all kinds of trauma, a war zone, problematic attachment. Like how does somebody like that integrate?
I think,
what do they do about their brain?
They need to have proper nourishment, good sleep, stress reduction. But the most important thing, like if I were going to give one tip to our listeners, to everyone, again, because I call it love food, from Firestone's theory of the inner defense mechanisms. I love his stuff. But when we connect with people, it's a form of nourishment. So for anyone out there, young child or adult, because integration is both a verb and a noun. So I have a state of integration. You have a state of integration pre-existing, but we're integrating. So someone, wherever they are in their life, if they can find people who bring them to higher states of integration, like a good therapist, right, it can improve their health. But I will say, when I talk about these 9 functions, the prefrontal cortex, these higher functions, the research shows 2 things improves 8 of the 9. One is having securely attached relationships, which is what I'm talking about.
Right.
And then the other is, we call them MAPS, M-A-P, a mindful awareness practice. It's just a fancy word for meditation, but it's like the neuroscience word for meditation.
Okay, so those actually make a difference. Being in a securely attached relationship, which you can create with a partner, right? You don't have to go back and do this with your dad somehow, right? And then meditation, basically. That those are both going to build strength in our brain.
Yeah. And so specifically, just so people can, so if I was going to say having securely attached relationships, having, like, for example, I would call the wheel of awareness. And for our listeners, I know you and I talked about this. If listeners want to email me, I will send them a handout that has this wheel of awareness meditation and this Tonglen kindness meditation. So that's kind of my third recommendation. There's this meditation I absolutely love that involves kindness.
Okay.
And in this Interpersonal Neurobiology, Dr. Dan Siegel, he came out with a new book that's a New York Times bestseller called Aware, the Power and Practice of Presence, where he talks about this wheel of awareness, which is this 5-minute meditation. But what's important about it is that it has what he calls the 3 pillars. So it is open awareness, focused attention, and an intention of kindness. So what we find is that those are 3 different types of meditation practice. All 3 are important. I like the wheel of awareness because it includes all 3, whereas you probably know this, when someone has a long history of trauma, if they begin to try and practice mindfulness, if they just sit there and they try and be aware of their breath, what will happen is they'll kind of disassociate, where they'll kind of check out and they're not be in their body. So all three of those are important. And the secret sauce for everyone who's listening, we'll get back to this when we're talking about improving our sex life. The secret sauce is the kindness. It's the kindness, because in that book, The Craving Mind, that I mentioned, I have this graph when I give talks that shows beginning meditators, experienced meditators, and then experienced meditators who add an intention of wonder and joy, which is kind of like that kindness.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of 10 structure brain part called the default mode network. If our listeners have heard that, it's just a part of the brain that's like ruminates, and it's I. It's just a part of you. So that part goes quiet the more you are an experienced meditator. But when you add kindness, then that's when the default mode network goes super quiet. So for all our listeners, when you're asking for tips, like the number one thing I'd say, and we have to do that with couples, they have to be kind with each other. They have to be kind with themselves. We have to be kind with ourselves to be able to change.
Mm-hmm. What are some signs that that somebody needs this kind of attention? I mean, like that they're less integrated, and it would be worth taking up a meditation practice and really working on the security of your relationship. I mean, obviously it would benefit everybody, but who listening should be thinking, oh, maybe I've got some of this going on, and I'd really benefit from increasing my level of integration.
I can't say enough for everyone listening about what the research is showing about just doing 5 minutes a day of some kind of mindfulness practice, because it's like brain physical therapy. A lot of us don't realize, like, have you ever seen those bodybuilders that are like really strong in the chest, but then they have tiny legs? If people can. So what can happen out there for people here who are very busy, they have the ability to do lots of things. Like they have lots of muscles in their chest, but their mind sight muscle, like their legs, could be very thin. And if they strengthen that muscle, which I think the way that you know that you have a strong muscle like that is that you're able to observe your thoughts, and you're able to observe your feelings, and you're able to have what's called response flexibility, where you pause between impulse and action. So that would be, if a person can do those things, definitely meditation would help. But if they can't do those things, if you're finding yourself having a lot of compulsive behaviors, and basically if your life is not what you want it to be, practicing meditation is a way to kind of get control of your life again.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So I'm thinking about people I know, clients or whatever, who get super triggered and flooded, and never seem to be able to get ahead of that. So this is interesting. This is putting it in a new context for me in terms of, wow, they need some work on that integration.
You can see it. There's lots of ways you can see how integrated a person is. Like one type of integration is called narrative integration, which is the story of themselves through time. And you can tell when I'm sure when a client comes to you and they begin to give a history, and they'll talk about when they were 12, and then they'll talk about when they're 60, and you're not really sure, and you have to slow them down. And the thing is there can be lots of different reasons why a person has impaired integration. Unfortunately, my partner is a physician, and we have a lot of toxins. I was going to say, unfortunately, there are a lot of toxins in our environment, in our food, heavy metals, all kinds of stuff. So I think what can happen is people can get, believe it or not, their diets, if they eat a lot of processed foods and stuff, they can have impaired integration just from a nutritional framework, even if they're hydrated and they're not getting enough sleep. So there's the physical component of impaired integration, but then there's sort of this mental, emotional piece of it too. And just for everyone listening, I think a big problem right now is people are just being flooded with too much information with emails and the texts and whatnot. And I do think that causes the default mode network to go like online more and more and more. They found in that Craving Mind book, when teenagers get likes like on Instagram, that it strengthens the default mode network, which again is that part of you which is like, I
me.
that. Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. That's an interesting association to put together, the the digital world and the social media notifications and everything with what our brain.
I know.
Yeah.
It's very overwhelming. And even hearing this talk, people could find themselves feeling overwhelmed. So as a presenter, I get very excited about this information, but at the same time, I try and slow people down. And I'm sure you try and do this as a therapist too.
Yeah.
What we want people to have the motivation and the courage to take the actions that they need to change, as opposed to being flooded by the anxiety and just not being able to make the change.
Right. Hey, it's Jessa here, just taking a quick break in the show. So glad you're with me today. I want to invite you to be a part of the conversation. I run a free Facebook group called Sex, Intimacy, and Relationships. And I share articles and resources. I foster conversation and community. I'm there to answer questions if you post them. And I broadcast live, delivering information, ideas, inspiration that could help you with your sex life. I'd love to have you join me there. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/community. So let's bring this whole idea into the bedroom, right? So how does this all apply to sex?
Right. So I'm a big fan of Lori Brotto. She's done a lot of mindfulness research.
Yeah.
And
I've interviewed her. I just haven't released that episode yet. So.
Oh my gosh. Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah.
So I have a couple quotes from her that I just want to read.
Yeah.
And I'm going to put it into, because we already spoke about how important it is, the mindfulness, to improve executive function. And then I'm going to directly relate that to the bedroom. So I have two quotes from her. Better Sex Through Mindfulness is her book. And she has a quote. It says, "All of the skills practiced in mindful awareness, noticing body sensations, being aware of the breath, observing sounds and thoughts, can be directly applied to sexual activity." That's the first quote. The other quote is, "I would argue that satisfying sex is quite simply not possible without mindfulness."
Mm-hmm.
So for our listeners, what I'm talking about, I would say that when you practice regular meditation, it allows you to cultivate things like response flexibility, where you can pause between impulse and action, and you can kind of dissect what's happening in the bedroom in your sex life. And let me talk about what I said earlier about differentiation and linkage for the couple.
Mm-hmm.
So before I do that, one activity, you probably heard of it, that sex therapists often give to couples is called sensate focus.
Right.
And for our listeners, that's basically where the couple goes and they explore touch. And what they've done is they differentiate touch from meaning it's going to turn into sex or intercourse.
Right.
So what's happening is the couple has a lot of fear and they're clumping together different things. So in a way, just sensate focus is about getting in your body and cultivating these higher functions of the prefrontal cortex, like insight, empathy, attuned communication, response flexibility. So hidden within these techniques that sex therapists recommend, like another one is called the cuddle couch, right? Where if one person has low desire and the other person, the couple, has high desire, sometimes they'll be, and what's happening is the low desire person will be touched, and then they get flooded thinking that it's going to mean that they're going to have to do more and more and more that they don't want to do. You create this safe zone where you know the touch isn't going to escalate to anything else, called the cuddle couch. And what you're doing in that is you're differentiating, touch from it meaning like a specific act. So meditation cultivates these higher functions, which then you can translate into the bedroom. And then specifically earlier when I talked about differentiation and linkage, high differentiation plus high linkage equals integration. So in the couple, what we want that couple and their arousability, their ability to become aroused. We want that highly differentiated. So what we want is we want each person in that couple to know what turns them on. They want to be really comfortable with their desire, with their ability to become aroused, independent of the other person.
Right.
And then also, that's differentiated. And then linked. Can the couple become aroused together? Can they highly link? So that's where, high differentiation, high link, then the couple's sex life is integrated.
Right. That makes sense to me. Yeah. And I guess when you're talking about, I'm thinking about how many clients get flooded around sex, or, they're busy with worried about whether it's going okay, or their expectations, or, that whole ruminating wheel can really get going.
Yeah, and I love Dr. Nagowski's kind of sexual excitation accelerator, the sexual accelerator, and the sexual inhibition system, or the sexual brakes, because I think of those as which are they're parts of the central nervous system that she named.
Right.
And I think they're very much like the limbic brain, which is like this fight, flight, freeze, stress response. That's kind of like the sexual brakes. And then you have the prefrontal cortex, which is like the sexual accelerator. So yeah, when people are getting flooded and they can't, what's happening is they're putting they need to turn off the offs, right? Their sexual brake is getting slammed. And so if you imagine if the couple can, in that moment, just stop and just do 5 minutes of mindfulness, authentic mindfulness, not like pretending to do mindfulness and holding their anger for 5 minutes, but just be aware of be aware of their breath and slow down, and then come back to the experience with new eyes. So one difference between being in the limbic brain versus being in the prefrontal cortex is in the limbic brain, you see the world as warlike, like very me, us versus them. And when you're in the prefrontal cortex, you see the world from a place of loving curiosity. So that would be for all couples here or individuals. If you can just shift your focus a little bit and be curious, that's a way that you allow yourself response flexibility, and you can maybe access some higher functions of the brain even when you're feeling really charged.
Yeah. All right. So you're even recommending people, if they're hitting some of these obstacles in a sexual encounter, in intimacy, take a pause right then. Take this 5 minutes each. I mean, I suppose together, differentiated yet linked, right? Sort of do this together individually.
Absolutely. I think
calm that system down, and that's going to make a big difference.
It is. And then the other thing I'll say about it is that some couples, they tend to talk, and then they tend to talk more, and then they tend to talk more. And so again, we don't always want to do the same solution. So if the couple is like talking a lot, but that's not leading to the outcome they seek, what we might want to do is differentiate from talking, and instead, be in the body, do that sensate focus, maybe just explore touch without talking. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, definitely at some point we want to be able to communicate, but then I'm sure you've seen it in your office. Sometimes we'll see people, so upset and talking so much that the talking not helpful.
Right. All right. So you've got a book, right? I don't know. Is it out already?
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. The Neuroscience of Dating.
Okay. Can you share a little bit, a tip or two from that?
Yeah.
Maybe you haven't shared already.
So what's interesting is that I dedicate the book to this concept that I call couple love or couple enlightenment. And I think it's what Stan Tatkin was talking about when he talked about the couple bubble, or like when we're merging together, we see ourselves as one unit. And why that's so important is that when we're talking about this high differentiation, high linkage, what happens is the couple that has high integration, they're unified as one unit. So they're highly differentiated from the rest of the world, and they're highly linked with each other, and that strengthens the couple. So I've had people who tell me they want to hear more about it, because what I talk about in neurobiology is that we have one person and they're doing what's called attuned communication and empathy with the other person. And that what that does is that provides love food to the other person, where they heal, and then they do it back and they heal each other. What happens, I call it like a healing generator. And then through that love, they can heal the world. That's kind of the concept. And I wrote this book because I think it's so important that people understand this principle, that people prioritize this principle, and that people find a partner, in the sense that being bonded with someone is so important for a person's overall mental health and for the health of the planet. And so it's so difficult, it can be, with the modern dating scene, that people easily get burned out and they just stop wanting to try. And so the book, my husband passed away in 2009. I was a caregiver for him. And then I was dating for about 7 years, and I did like everything wrong. So the book is just based on my knowledge of neuroscience. It outlines like a specific equation with tips. But I've had people buy the book just because they're interested in this integration.
Yeah.
And I apply dating to the formula, but you can use the same formula. I talk about this river of brain integration and the setting sun, and then the destination is the 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex and the 9 domains of integration. So I give a map, a visual map for people, and then I give specific, and what you want to do in dating and in life is you want to screen people for their level of integration. You can look at these higher functions like empathy and insight. You can test people, response flexibility, and I recommend doing that when you're dating to save a person time and money.
Well, yeah, because basically whoever you bring into your life like that is going to affect your brain, right? For better or for worse. So let's be mindful about that.
Oh, you know what? And you did ask me one tip. So here's my one tip for this is like priceless if anyone actually on the podcast is listening. So I have this thing I call the 2 protective principles.
Okay.
And it's don't make yourself financially vulnerable and don't make yourself sexually vulnerable. And I tell people, you have to decide what those mean for you. You have to take the time to write it down and define it, and then you stick to those principles. And then what will happen is, like, if on your second date you realize that the person you're dating is married or whatever it is, it inevitably happens in dating where the person lies to you. Sometimes it takes a few months to really figure out what's going on. And as long as you don't make yourself overly vulnerable, then you're you're not so burned. That's the idea with those 2 tips.
Yeah. Well, and it's about sort of staying in your thinking, choiceful brain too, right? Don't make decisions from the lizard brain back here, but use your executive functioning. Yeah.
Yeah. And we talk about that as sex educators, right? Like, for example, I talk about Stella Resnick and how she talks about like stupid in love. I have this slide in my dating safety where we get impaired when we're really, really enamored. We just lose executive function. So that's why people have to think ahead for a plan or have phrases in their head like your condoms are mine, or there's things that people should plan ahead, because when the moment happens, sometimes you're just so flooded by the dopamine and the oxytocin that it just feels so good. You're like, you don't even want to think about next day, right?
Right. Well, thank you so much. Will you just say a word about where people can find out more about you, find your book, what you might like to promote?
Yeah, so I am getting ready. I'm recording courses right now on Teachable. So people if people like what they're hearing me say here, I have kind of coalesced a bunch of information together in this kind of fascinating framework. It involves interpersonal neurobiology, why people why they have impaired integration. It involves Firestone's defense mechanisms. He calls them the fantasy bond and the inner critical voice. And so people exist on a level of integration from low to high. We've been talking about this whole call.
Right.
But when I talk about Firestone's defense mechanisms, when people have like low integration, they're what he calls, they have inwardness, or they're highly defended. And it's because of these defense mechanisms that develop when they're younger. So I explain these defense mechanisms. So I'm teaching a course on Teachable. And so people can look for me. I have a website called HeidiCrockett.com. It links to 2 blogs. I have Green Light Heidi and I have Red Light Heidi. So people can find me on my Red Light Heidi is my sexual health, and my Green Light Heidi is like my wellness and whatnot. And the Neuroscience of Dating is on Amazon for people who are listening. Yeah.
Great. I'll put links to all that too in the show notes so that people can get to it easily, as well as I've been taking notes about all the different books you've mentioned too. So I'll link those as well.
Oh, great. Yeah. All those books are fantastic. I've mentioned a number of them. I'm happy to talk with you afterwards. Yeah, everyone. I'm so happy to encourage people to do mindfulness. That I've mentioned that Craving Mind book a number of times. He just came out with a new app called unwindinganxiety.com. And I like it because it's based on his 25 years worth of research. He has 3 apps. One's called Eat Right Now. The second's called Craving to Quit. And the other is Unwinding Anxiety. The Eat Right Now is for people who overeat. The Craving to Quit is for people who smoke cigarettes. And the Unwinding Anxiety is for people who have anxiety. But what I like about that is it's an app based on his 25 years worth of research, so it's not just some random app. He spent a lot of time making it. So I just want to encourage people to do things to increase their intelligence. And if people want to get in touch with me, again, I'll give them that will of awareness meditation and that kindness meditation.
Yeah, great.
I just appreciate you for having me on.
Yeah, well, thank you so, so much.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.